Have you ever looked at a property's price tag and wondered, where does that number actually come from? Well, today, we're going to peel back the layers on a concept that professionals live by, but most of us never even think about. It's this idea that a property isn't one thing, but two, the land and the building on it. So let's dive right in.
Okay, so picture this. You see a house listed for 10 million pesos. Simple enough, right? You pay the money, you get the keys. But what did you really just buy? Is it just the house? Well, the answer is a whole lot more complex and honestly, a lot more interesting.
And here's the kicker. When you buy that property, you're actually buying two completely separate assets that are moving in totally opposite directions financially. On one hand, you have the land, which most of the time is appreciating. It's going up in value. But on the other hand, you have the building itself, the improvements, and that is constantly depreciating. It's getting older, there's wear and tear, it's going down in value. Wild, right? One price, two assets, heading in opposite directions.
So, that brings us right to the heart of what we're talking about today, the two-part property puzzle. We're going to explore exactly why professionals can't just slap a single price on a property. They absolutely have to separate the value of the land from the value of the building.
This isn't just some academic exercise. There are real-world reasons for this. For starters, a key valuation method, the cost approach, is literally built on this separation. But it's also a legal thing. In the Philippines, for example, the assessor's office needs it. The Bureau of Internal Revenue, the BIR, needs it for taxes, and even insurance companies need it. And finally, it all comes down to analytical integrity. It just keeps the numbers clean and prevents you from making huge mistakes like double counting value.
So how do they actually do this? Well, that leads us to the primary tool that appraisers use to solve this puzzle. Let's get into the golden rule of value, the cost approach. And this quote right here, this is the bedrock of the entire process. In the cost approach, the land must be valued separately, as if vacant. Just for a second, imagine the building isn't there. Poof, it's gone. What would someone be willing to pay for just that empty plot of land? That question, that single idea, is the starting point for everything else.
And of course, there's a formula that ties it all together. Total value, or V, equals the land value, LV, plus a figure for the building. Now that building value is calculated as the replacement cost new, or RCN, that's what it would cost to build the exact same house today, minus all the wear and tear it suffered over the years, which is depreciation, or D. So you find the land value first, figure out what the building's worth today, and then you add them up.
Okay, so if step one is to value the land as if it's empty, how in the world do you find that number? Well, the best, most reliable, and most preferred method is what's known as the market data approach. The market data approach, or MDA, is actually pretty simple in concept. It all boils down to something called the principle of substitution. Basically, a smart buyer isn't going to pay more for your land than what a similar substitute piece of land just sold for down the street. So what you do is you find recent sales of other vacant lots that are similar to yours and you compare. It's that straightforward.
Now, to do this right, professionals follow a very strict process. First, they go hunting for data on recent sales of vacant lots in the area. Then, and this is super important, they verify those sales were arm's length. That just means it was a normal, fair transaction, not a desperate foreclosure sale or a special deal between family members. After they pick a metric, like price per square meter, they start the adjustment process to account for differences, before finally reconciling all that information to land on a final value.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Let's walk through an example. Say a comparable lot sold for 10,000 pesos per square meter a few months ago. Well, if prices have gone up 5% since then, you adjust for that. Now, if that comparable lot was in a worse location than yours, you have to add value to its price to bring it up to your level. But maybe your lot is bigger, which can sometimes mean a lower per square meter price, so you adjust down. After you run all the numbers, you get your indicated value.
Now look, the MDA is the gold standard for a reason. It reflects what real people are actually doing and paying in the market. But it's not perfect, especially in a place like the Philippines. For one, finding good, reliable sales data can be incredibly difficult. And a really common problem is that sale prices are often underdeclared to save on taxes, which can totally skew the data you're relying on.
So that brings up a pretty obvious question, right? What happens when the best method just isn't an option? What do you do when you look around and there are simply no vacant lots to compare yours to? Well, appraisers have a couple of clever workarounds for exactly this situation.
I mean, think about it. If you're in a super dense, built-up area like the Makati Central Business District, trying to find a recently sold vacant lot is, well, it's pretty much impossible. So how on earth do you figure out the value of the land sitting under a giant skyscraper?
You can't use that direct market data approach.
The first workaround is a technique called the extraction method. It's pretty clever. You basically work backward. You find a similar property nearby that has sold recently, building and all, and you subtract the estimated value of its building. The logic is that whatever's left over, well, that must be the value of the land.
And the formula for this just puts that simple idea into math. The land value equals the sales price of that comparable property minus its depreciated improvement value. That's the building's current worth. You're literally extracting the land value from the total sale price.
So, for a quick example, if a house down the street just sold for 12 million pesos, and an appraiser calculates that its building, after all the depreciation, is currently worth about 6 million, you just do the subtraction. 12 million minus 6 million, boom! You get an extracted land value of 6 million pesos. Simple as that.
All right, the second workaround is a bit more of a broad strokes approach. It's called the allocation method. With this one, you figure out the typical ratio of land value to total property value in that specific area, and then you just apply that percentage to your property.
And the formula for this? It's about as simple as it gets. Land value equals the total value of your property multiplied by whatever that typical land ratio is for the neighborhood.
So, let's say your property is valued at 10 million pesos. And your research shows that in your neighborhood, the land typically accounts for about 40% of the total property value. Well, you just multiply. 40% of 10 million is 4 million pesos. That becomes your allocated land value. It's not as precise as other methods, but it's a really useful tool when good data is hard to come by. Okay, so now that we've covered the different methods, let's talk about the final polish. This is the stuff that really separates the pros from the amateurs, the common mistakes you absolutely want to avoid. Before an appraiser even starts crunching numbers, they have to apply this mandatory filter called highest and best use. What this means is that you have to value the land based on the most productive thing you could do with it that's legally allowed, physically possible, and financially makes sense. So, if land is zoned for a high-rise condo but someone's just using it as a parking lot, you value it as if it had the condo on it. You value its potential, not its current underutilized state.
And that leads us right into some really common and very costly errors. A huge one is confusing the government's zonal value with the real market value. Let me be clear, they are not the same thing. Other big mistakes include completely ignoring that highest and best use principle we just talked about, using terrible comparable sales that aren't actually comparable at all, or getting the depreciation math all wrong when you're trying to use the extraction method.
So the next time you look at a property's price, you'll know the secret. It's not just one number. It's this dynamic duo of appreciating land and a depreciating building all rolled into one. And that leaves me with one final question for you to chew on. Now that you know how the pros do it, is the land under your own home actually more valuable than the house itself? Something to think about.